All right, guys, welcome to Chapter 18, How Do We Conserve Biodiversity? The opening story discusses the importance of conservation by highlighting a marine national monument in Hawaii. And just to point out, it might be important to go back and reference what public land designations are, what the goals of the designation is, and what some common functions are of the responsible parties. All right, so this is a close-up of the area that was discussed in the opening story, the Hawaiian Marine National Monument. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of it. But anyway, the idea is in protecting any type of land or area is that the area that's protected, you'll start to see increases in the numbers of populations that they're trying to protect. And at some point, that those organisms will populate the non-protected area surrounding the Marine National Monument, and again, any other area. And that we refer to as spillover. All right, I had given you an acronym earlier in the year about ways that you can remember some of the threats to biodiversity. It's a big, fat animal. All right, the H in this big, fat animal stands for habitat. I, invasive species, which can also be called alien species. Human population growth, pollution, overharvesting. So the acronym is HIPPO. And just a reminder, we are currently in the sixth mass extinction, and the difference between this and all others is that this is solely human caused. All right, and these are some pictures of organisms that are in that National Marine Monument. These are endemic to Hawaii, and so that word endemic means that it can only be found in this area. Yeah, monk seal, the green sea turtle, not endemic, but it is endangered. All right, so when we look at global declines in genetic diversity, we understand that the lower the genetic biodiversity within a population, the less likely that population will survive any type of an environmental change. And environmental change is really the driving force behind evolution. So I've got a couple of pictures on this slide that go back to, I think, chapter 5, maybe 6, that kind of remind us of ways population genetic diversity declines. And one method is the genetic drift. Another is called the bottleneck effect, and the other is called a founder's effect. So if those words sound familiar, but you don't really know what I'm talking about, go back and look them up. And again, it would be under ecological biology, population biology, excuse me. All right. So not only are we seeing a decline in biodiversity amongst wild organisms, but also with domestic organisms that are used for livestock and crops. And, you know, typically what I'm showing on this slide are just representations of the single genetic variety that we're getting. So when you buy chicken in the store and it's farm raised, it's coming from a bird with white feathers, and they all are pretty much, you know, they're a pedigree, so they're pretty purebred. The same goes for seeds. So when we talk about things like corn, it's the same, or wheat, whatever, it's the same with them. All right, there is an international effort, however, to protect seed variety. It's sometimes referred to as the Doomsday Vault. And let me see if I can get onto this. So hang on. Shoot. Okay, this is it.
Just look at the landscape around us and how remote this is. And then jutting out of the side of this Arctic mountain is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And we have all been very excited to actually get inside and see for ourselves how what's being done here plays a very vital role when it comes to trying to mitigate against the consequences of climate change. So this is it.
This is it. This is the vault. This is what is built for humanity to survive. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. It's here since 2008, built by the government of Norway, and it's one of the most amazing things you're going to see in your life. Yeah, they look funny, but they protect you against ice falling down in the vault.
It's that cold.
It's that cold. So that's about 150 meters down into the mountain. This is becoming the permafrost here in granite. They built this like they built the tunnels in the Alps with a big machine, a big excavator. Took about 2 years to build, and it's built to last for a very long time. This is meant to be your way out if the power fails, if there is no lights, so you find your way out of the vault. So the seed deposit works like with any bank and a safe deposit storage in the basement of the bank. You bring your own seeds. You, as a depositing institution, you own them and you keep them, and only you can determine what happens with them. This is the main door to the active vault, one of the 3 vaults that we have. It's all frozen up because inside it's minus 18 Celsius year round. And this is typically the place everyone wants to have a picture taken. This is World Agriculture behind that door. Everything you're going to need for the world to survive in terms of agriculture is safely kept here for the future. We have 860,000 types of crops. Each probe has 100 to 1,000 corns. So if you look at the number of individual grains in here, it could be close to 1 billion.
My nose is going to fall off already.
You need to keep warm here with everything that you can. And when you go inside, it gets colder because of the draft of the AC. You could go back to Svalbard and recreate agriculture in the world, which I find an amazing concept.
In the event of a cataclysmic occurrence, this would stay and preserve these seeds for how long?
We have minus 18 Celsius in here. It would go up to minus 8, minus 7 after a few years. But then even at that temperature, most of the seeds can stay for many, many years, 10, 20, 30 years time. So you have a lot of time to think about what to do, even if power fails here and doesn't get restored. It's a safe place.
It is truly remarkable and such a unique experience. The general population doesn't have access to this vault, and we're among the few who have actually been inside. And as Michael said, it really does make you pause and think about how what is being done here is really helping to safeguard our future.
All right, so I hope you liked that video. Okay. All right, so what are some characteristics of endangered species? Again, I would encourage that you review population ecology, and I believe, again, chapter 5 or 6. But the organism needs to have a low reproductive rate, so that would be a K-selected species. Specialized niches limit them. They have a very narrow distribution, again, it limits them. And that brings us back to that vocabulary word, endemic species, only found in one unique location. Rare, anything that's got commercial value. If they feed at a very high trophic level, and if they have fixed migratory patterns, or if they require an extremely large territory. So these are all areas of, or I should say characteristics of organisms that might become endangered or are already listed as endangered. All right, this next slide gets us back to the I in HIPPO, and often FRQ questions will ask for individual actions one could do to alleviate whatever the environmental problem is that they're asking you about. And so in terms of biodiversity, increasing it, some individual things that we can do is to prevent the spread of invasive species. So kind of read through these, You may know some of them already, but if you don't, jot one or two down and remember that as an example. All right. This question, should we protect individual species or ecosystems, really, I think, stems more from history. Currently, today, we've got more legislation, more policy that supports both species or ecosystem. But if you had to make that choice, it's not an easy choice. And earlier on in our environmental movements, I should say, that occurred as a result of the EPA and other organizations. But in the 70s, we created lots of different groups. So anyway, sorry, got sidetracked here. Some species-specific act would be something called the Lacey Act, and this was one of the earliest legislations. And originally, it was signed so that you couldn't cross state lines with a specific bird or mammal, and it tended to focus on game animals, so deer, game birds, ducks, that sort of thing. Today it's been amended to include all plants and non-game animals as well. CITES is an international trade agreement, and basically, not agreement, excuse me, but a trade policy that protects endangered species. And that policy was designed by a group of over 100 international nations, and they created something called a red list. And a red list is basically a list of all the plants and animals by location that are threatened or endangered. So again, just a reminder, that word endangered means the organism is in danger of extinction. So it's a much more severe classification than threatened. All right, some more species-specific legislation is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and you know, this may seem like, well, shouldn't this also be covered under the others? But you're looking at this being more import and export, so it's not just state lines. This is crossing international borders. And as an example, in Canada, it is legal for anyone to purchase some of the tusks that you see in this photo here, or otter pelts. You can even buy narwhal tusks. However, you can't drive over the border or ship them legally to the United States. You would be committing a federal crime. The Endangered Species Act is an excellent domestic act to remember, because this is one of those acts that started off as species specific, but then was amended later on to include habitat. So this is something that protects both organisms and habitat. That's an excellent law to remember for an FRQ reference. The Convention on Biological Diversity is really, again, an international group of countries that came up with some objectives to protect biodiversity. They also adopted this concept called biodiversity hotspots, and so I've got a short video that reviews them.
What we're going to talk about right now is something called a biodiversity hotspot. How do you figure out what the places are on Earth that deserve our special focus, that deserve attention that they need to protect them for future generations? It's obvious that the Earth is in trouble, and we can't save the entire planet all at once. We need to have a focus. We can't do triage on an entire planet. We've limited resources. We have limited time. We're running out of time to protect many of these places. So what are the criteria that we use to try and figure out what those hotspots really are that need that special attention for protection? Back in 1988, ancient history to some of us, and in fact might be prehistory to others, There was a scientist by the name of Norman Myers who wrote a really important paper that analyzed different types of geological, climatological, and uniqueness criteria to come up with the concept of a hotspot. Scientists who looked at this problem decided eventually that there really were two main criteria that were going to lead to what Conservation International now recognizes as a biodiversity hotspot. One criterion was that there had to be at least 1,500 endemic species of plants. We'll get back to the idea of endemism in a moment. There also had to be an additional factor that made the area unique and deserving of our focus. There had to be more than 70% of the original habitat already lost, which highlighted the need to designate this place as a hotspot. Well, why plants? Plants, particularly in terrestrial environments, are crucial. Animals go where the plants are. Plants are the primary producers. They're at the base of food webs. Life attracts other life, and it depends on other life. Now let's get back to that idea of endemism. An endemic species is a species that's found in a certain area and nowhere else on Earth. In other words, endemism is a measure of how unique and irreplaceable something is. An example of an endemic organism that resonates with people love tortoises. If you think about the Galapagos Islands, for example, most islands have their own special type of tortoise. It lives there and nowhere else. So if something happens to wipe out the tortoises on that island, those tortoises are gone forever. They're not found anyplace else. They were irreplaceable. At the moment, Conservation International formally recognizes 34 biodiversity hotspot areas on Earth. The interesting thing about this is that less than 3% of the Earth's land surface area is represented by these hotspots. So we're talking about some very, very special places indeed. There are other ways to think about these special places on Earth besides hotspots. Some of these concepts are used to help recognize larger geographical units of land and water that have unique assemblages of species or distinct environmental conditions that make them worthy of our special attention. I think it's really important that we recognize that the hotspot idea is much more than a conservation tool. It's actually become a powerful scientific tool, because hotspots are a blood pressure cuff for planet Earth. You can go back and keep measuring the effects on these different places due to human activity or environmental change of various kinds, and go through the science of measuring the pressure on biodiversity. In a sense, hotspots are almost like avatars. They're like representatives for other endangered areas on the planet that might not necessarily meet the special criteria of 1,500 endemic species of plants and more than 70% of the original habitat loss. And yet, they are still obviously critical and important places for lots of organisms to live. You need to think about hotspots as a network of places on Earth that are interconnected. Not just single units that protect small pieces of biodiversity, but that help preserve biodiversity in a great many other habitats and other hotspots as well. And lots of conservation organizations, government agencies, and even concerned people like all of us can use these hotspots to better help direct the resources to the places that require our greatest attention. Above all, we need to remember one overriding principle: that we focus on protecting the highest number of species that we can, especially the ones that are most threatened. That's what this hotspot concept is trying to get to. We want to enhance our ability to protect species richness. That way, we can boost the stability and resilience of ecosystems. So I think that for me, these hotspots really do carry that special signal and are really worthy of the special effort that's being developed over the last few decades to monitor them, to provide the good, solid science that helps us not just to define them, but to monitor and promote their health down the road, and to employ those concepts to draw people in, to develop that people power that's really necessary to move forward with the protection of life on Earth.
All right. presentation here. So, all right, guys. So anyway, let me escape. All right, sorry, getting sidetracked once again. All right, so the other point that's made is that whenever you're protecting any area or land area, to avoid fragmentation and really look at how close how close it is to other areas, how large the area it is, and so forth. So kind of going back to chapter 6, where some of those things were talked about in more detail. The biosphere reserve is just another example of a spillover effect, or a trickle out effect. So you'll get a trickle out of biodiversity from the core towards the transition zones. So that's kind of a neat engineering way of looking at maximizing biodiversity in an area. And then last but not least, your chapter concludes by asking you to really remember what ecosystem services are and some very specific ecosystem services that are provided, for example, by a wetland or a forest. So again, go back and review some of that information. I've got a very short clip on coral reefs, so that'll give you a couple of reminders there. Again, I've got this posted, but also have a video clip. So let me show you that real quickly.
Of climate change to coral reefs is due to increasing sea surface temperature. So as CO2 builds up in the atmosphere, the air and the water warms. And so we've actually already seen warming of about 0.5 to 0.7 degrees Celsius across the world surface oceans. And this means a lot to coral reefs actually, because they are an animal that lives what we call really close to their thermal tolerance, and so they have a very small range of temperatures at which they do best in. And temperatures of even 1 degree Celsius above the warmest temperature they see in the summertime can actually cause significant stress.
Rising temperatures throughout the global seas in coral ecosystems means the proliferation of more diseases. It means things like coral bleaching, the death of corals due to basically overheating. And then this notion of ocean acidification. These reef-building corals can no longer really build the hard structures due to this change in ocean chemistry.
The problem now is that there's so many of these different threats, and then you overlay the threat of climate change with the sea surface temperature increase, with ocean acidification. And the reefs are less healthy in general, and so it's harder for the reef then to recover from these other events or stresses. The biggest thing that we can do to stop the threat of climate change to coral reefs is to stop putting as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, to actually stop the warming we're seeing. There are things that we can do locally to improve resilience of reefs. And so the Coral Reef Conservation Program's approach is one of science and research to better understand impacts of climate change to coral reefs, and then using that information to build tools and products for managers to better understand reef resilience and how to increase the health of their reefs and what actions they can take on the ground. And then also to assist in education of stakeholders, of those people who use the reef, so that we're using the reefs as smartly as we can. If we address carbon emissions and we are able to stabilize the temperature changes that we're seeing, I think that we're still at a point where reefs can become healthy and flourishing again.
All right, so that was your presentation on coral reefs, and let's see. And that pretty much concludes our unit on Chapter 18. It ends in a nice way because it sort of prepares you for Chapter 19, which is on climate change. Thank you for your attention.